My name is Arturo. On my 85th birthday, my only son told me that my life stories were worthless and that nobody was interested in hearing them. He said it right there, in front of his wife and my grandchildren, without even looking up from his phone. In that moment, something inside me, something that had been cracking for years, finally broke for good. It wasn't anger I felt, but a cold, heavy silence, the kind you feel when you realize you've become invisible to the people you gave everything for. A man can endure poverty, hard work, and pain, but to be erased by your own blood, that's a different kind of death. What would you do in my place? Listen to my story until the end, and tell me, what would you have done? And please, let me know from which city in Mexico you're listening. I need to know I'm not alone in this. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. The party, if you could call it that, was at my son Roberto's apartment in San Pedro Garza Garcia. It's one of those modern places where everything is white and gray, so clean and new it feels like nobody actually lives there. It's a world away from the little house in the Colonia Independencia where I raised him, a house I built with my own hands, brick by brick, with the money I earned working for 40 years at the steel mill. I sat on a fancy sofa that was probably worth more than my entire pension, watching them. Roberto, his wife Amanda, and my 2 teenage grandchildren, Mateo and Sofia. They were all there for me, supposedly, but their faces were lit up by the glow of their cell phones. They were planning a trip to Cancun, talking about flight prices and hotels, their voices buzzing around me like flies I couldn't be bothered to swat away. I was just a piece of old furniture in the corner of the room. I cleared my throat, trying to find my voice, which felt rusty from disuse. I wanted to tell them a story. Not just any story, but one I thought they needed to hear. I wanted to tell them about the time, back in the 70s, when me and my compadres from the mill got together on our days off to build the first little chapel in our neighborhood. We had no money, just scrap wood, leftover rebar, and a will as strong as the steel we forged every day. I remember the smell of wet cement and the feeling of community, of building something together that would outlast us. For me, that was true wealth. I started, this reminds me of when we built the chapel of San Judas. I saw a flicker of excitement in my own eyes in the reflection of the black television screen across from me. I didn't even get to the good part. Roberto cut me off, his thumb still swiping across his screen. He didn't shout. It was worse. His voice was flat, annoyed, like I was a telemarketer calling at dinner time. "Dad, please, not right now," he said, the words slicing through the air. "Can we save the good old days stories for another time? No one's really interested." He didn't look at me. Not once. Amanda, my daughter-in-law, gave a tight, condescending little smile and nodded in agreement, as if to say, "Thank you for shutting the old man up." My grandchildren just kept staring at their phones, oblivious. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It was thick with humiliation. It filled my lungs and made it hard to breathe. I just nodded. I lowered my head and stared at my own hands, the gnarled, scarred hands that had worked so hard to give him the life that now had no room for me. I didn't say another word for the rest of the night. They brought out a cake with candles, sang a half-hearted Las Mañanitas, and I blew out the flames, but I didn't make a wish. What was there to wish for? They cut me a slice, but it tasted like cardboard in my mouth. I watched them laugh and talk about their future, a future I had paid for but was not invited to. In that cold, white room, under the glare of the fancy lights, I felt a strange calm wash over me. The pain was still there, but it was hardening into something else. It was turning into a decision. A final, quiet, and absolute decision about my legacy, my dignity, and the one thing I still had left that they couldn't take away from me, my story. My life didn't start in that cold, white apartment in San Pedro. It started in the dust of a small town in Zacatecas, a place where the sun baked the earth until it cracked, and the only thing that grew in abundance was hope. I came to Monterey in the 50s with nothing but a change of clothes and a cardboard suitcase and a fire in my belly. The city was a monster of smoke and noise, and at its heart was the fundidora, the steel mill. They said it was the heart of Mexico's progress, but for men like me, it was a furnace that demanded your youth in exchange for a steady wage. I saw it not as a prison, but as a door to a life where my children wouldn't have to eat dust for breakfast. That was the dream that got me on the bus, and it was the dream I carried into the mill every single day for 40 years. The work, Hijo, you can't imagine it. The heat was a living thing, it wrapped around you, seeped into your bones. The noise of the machinery was a constant roar that you still heard in your sleep, years after you retired. I saw men lose fingers. I saw them get burns that left scars like maps of strange countries on their skin. I have my own maps on my hands and arms. They are the price I paid. But there was a pride in it, too. A man knew he was earning his bread with the sweat of his brow and the strength of his back. We were asterisk compañeros. We looked out for each other. We'd share a cold Coca-Cola in the shade during our break, and for those 10 minutes, we weren't just workers. We were men, sharing stories of our wives and our kids. Those hands that my son couldn't look at, they built his future. I met my Elena at a dance in the Colonia Acero. She wasn't the fanciest girl there, but she had a light in her eyes that outshone everything. She worked sewing dresses. Her fingers, as nimble as mine, were clumsy and calloused. She saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. She saw a good man, she used to say. We married and moved into a tiny 2-room house in the Independencia. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a tin roof. But Elena, she turned it into a palace. The smell of her frijoles de la olla, simmering on the stove, was the smell of home. She was the one who would patch my work clothes, who would put a cool cloth on my forehead when I came home exhausted. She was my anchor, my port in the storm of that life. Then Roberto was born. I remember the first time I held him. He was so small, so perfect. His tiny hand wrapped around my calloused finger, and right then, something shifted inside me forever. It wasn't just my life anymore. It was his. I looked at this little boy, my son, and I made a promise to God and to myself. This boy would not work in the furnace. He would use his mind, not his back. He would have all the opportunities I never did. He would go to a university. He would be a licenciado, an engineer, something important. That tiny baby in my arms became my new reason for breathing, for facing the heat and the noise every single day. Every drop of my sweat was an investment in his future. The sacrifices were a part of life. You didn't even think of them as sacrifices. They were just what you did. I remember Roberto wanting a fancy bicycle he saw in a store window downtown. It cost a fortune, almost a month's wages. That same month, my work boots had holes in them, and my feet would get soaked when it rained. Elena looked at me, and I looked at her. We didn't even have to say anything. I patched my boots with a piece of tire rubber, and we saved every extra peso. For his birthday, we surprised him with that bicycle. The look on his face, that pure, shining joy, it was worth 100 pairs of new boots. It was worth everything. That's what a father does. You plug the holes in your own life so that your child's life can be whole. Our little house was always full of life. It was nothing like the silent, sterile apartment where my son lives now. On weekends, the sound of music from the neighbors' radios would mix with the smell of carne asada from someone's grill. Roberto would play soccer in the street with his friends until I'd call him in for dinner. Our table was small and rickety, but the food Elena made was a feast. She could make a few potatoes and some chorizo feed us for 2 days and make it taste like the best meal in the world. We didn't have much, but we had each other. We had laughter. We had a home that was built not just with bricks and cement, but with love and a shared dream. That was the kind of wealth my son, with all his money, will never understand. I tried to be a good father. I taught Roberto how to be a man, or at least what I thought a man should be. I taught him to be honest, to work hard, to respect his mother. I remember one afternoon, the faucet in the kitchen sink was leaking. I took out my old tools, and I showed him, step by step, how to take it apart, replace the worn-out empaque, and put it back together. I told him, son, it's important to know how to fix things with your own hands. It teaches you to not depend on anyone. He was bored, I could tell. He wanted to go play video games. But he did it. For a little while, I thought he understood. I was so proud of him, not for fixing the faucet, but for the possibility that he was learning the value of self-reliance. The dream of the university became our family's obsession. It was the great project. Elena and I talked about it in hushed tones at night, after Roberto was asleep. The Tec de Monterrey. It was for the rich kids, for the families with names. For a steelworker's son, it was like wanting to go to the moon. But we were determined. I started taking on extra shifts, the graveyard shifts, that nobody wanted, because they wrecked your body. I'd come home when the sun was rising, my eyes burning with exhaustion, and I'd pass Elena in the doorway as she was leaving for her sewing work. We were a team, working around the clock, pouring every ounce of our energy into that single goal. We wanted our son to climb so high that he would never have to look back at the poverty we came from. Then Elena got sick. It started slowly, a tiredness she couldn't shake. Then the doctors gave it a name, a cruel one. The light in her eyes began to dim. The house grew quiet. The smell of her cooking, was replaced by the smell of medicine. My life became a painful routine. The furnace at the mill, the sterile white walls of the hospital, and the worried face of my teenage son. I tried to be strong for both of them. I'd tell her jokes, I'd bring her flowers I picked from a neighbor's garden, I'd sit by her bed and hold her hand, a hand that felt smaller and more fragile each day. The savings we had for the university, they started to disappear on doctors and treatments. It was the scariest time of my life, watching the two pillars of my world crumble at the same time. One evening, the doctor told me there was nothing more they could do. I sat with Elena all night. The only sound in the room was the soft beep of a machine and her shallow breathing. She knew. She gathered what little strength she had, pulled my hand closer, and looked at me with what was left of that beautiful light in her eyes. "Arturo," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves, "promise me, take care of our boy, but never, ever let him forget where we came from. Make him understand that his greatest wealth is his roots, his family, us." I couldn't speak. I just squeezed her hand and nodded, tears streaming down my face. I promised her. It was the most sacred vow I have ever made. She passed away before the sun came up, and a part of me died with her. Life after she was gone was a gray fog. The house felt huge and empty. The silence was deafening. Roberto was a teenager then, and he retreated into his own world of grief, a world I couldn't enter. I tried. I tried to cook for him, but my food tasted like ash compared to his mother's. I tried to talk to him, but we didn't have the words. He was focused on his studies, and I was focused on my promise. I worked harder than ever, driven by a desperate need to fulfill her last wish, to get him into that university. The distance between us grew, not out of anger, but out of a shared sorrow we didn't know how to bridge. He was on his path, and I was just the man paying for the pavement. The day he graduated from the tech was the proudest and saddest day of my life. I stood there, in my best and only suit, which smelled faintly of mothballs, and I watched him walk across the stage to get his diploma. My son, the engineer. I had done it. Elena, we had done it. But as I looked around at the other families, at their expensive clothes and confident smiles, I felt like a ghost. I was an old, weathered relic from another world. Roberto introduced me to some of his friends, and I could see the confusion in their eyes. This rough-looking old man with calloused hands couldn't possibly be the father of their sophisticated friend. In that moment of my greatest triumph as a father, I had never felt more alone. Then came Amanda. Roberto brought her to the house for dinner one Sunday. She was polished, elegant, and she looked around my simple home as if it were a museum of poverty. She complimented my cooking, but she barely touched her food. I saw the way she looked at the old photographs on the wall, the one of me and Elena, on our wedding day. It wasn't with interest, but with a kind of detached pity. I knew right then that she would be the one to complete the process of pulling him away. She represented the world he now wanted to belong to, a world where there was no room for an old steelworker and his stories of the past. She was the final lock on a door that had been closing for years. The changes were swift after they married. They bought the apartment in San Pedro, a place so different from our little house in the asterisk Colonia. They helped me by redecorating my house, which meant they got rid of all of Elena's old furniture, her tablecloths, the things that held her memory. They said it was to modernize the place, to make it more comfortable for me. But it felt like they were erasing her, and by extension, erasing my past. The visits became less frequent. The phone calls became shorter. When my grandchildren were born, I was allowed to see them on a schedule. "Don't tire yourself out, Papa," Roberto would say, which was his way of saying, "Don't overstay your welcome." I was becoming a duty, an obligation. I remember one Christmas, a few years before that fateful birthday. The whole family was gathered at their apartment. They exchanged expensive gifts, designer purses for Amanda, the newest video game console for the kids, a fancy watch for Roberto. When it was my turn, Roberto handed me a small, neat envelope. Inside was a gift card to a department store. "So you can buy yourself whatever you need, Dad," he said with a manufactured smile. He didn't know what I needed. He hadn't asked. He hadn't looked closely enough to see that my shoes were worn, or that my favorite sweater was frayed at the cuffs. The gift card wasn't a present, it was a transaction. It was a way of settling a debt, of checking a box on their to-do list. Take care of the old man. On many lonely nights, I would sit in my quiet, modernized house and think about my promise to Elena. I would talk to her photograph, the only thing of hers I had managed to save from the purge. "I failed, my love," I would whisper. "I gave him the world, and in it he lost himself. He forgot us." I felt a profound sense of failure, a guilt that gnawed at me. I had kept the first part of the promise. I had taken care of our boy, but I had failed miserably at the second. But as I sat there in that cold apartment on my 85th birthday, listening to the silence after my son's cruel words, something else began to stir within that guilt. It wasn't failure I felt anymore. It was clarity, a cold, hard clarity. Perhaps there was still a way to honor my promise to Elena, a final lesson to teach, a story to be told, not with words, but with consequences. That humiliation on my birthday wasn't a sudden storm. It was the final drop of rain in a bucket that had been filling for years, drip by painful drip. The emptiness began the day we buried Elena. After the funeral, Roberto and I came back to the house, and the silence was a physical presence. It sat between us at the dinner table, it filled her side of the bed, it echoed in every room. We were two men drowning in the same ocean of grief, but on separate islands. He buried his sorrow in his studies and his new life, and I was left alone in the museum of our shared past, a past he was already trying to escape. The distance didn't start with anger, it started with that shared unspoken pain that we never learned how to navigate together. His visits, at first, were frequent. He'd come by after his classes at the Tech, and we'd sit in the kitchen, mostly in silence. I'd make coffee, the way his mother used to, but it never tasted the same. We had lost our translator. Elena was the one who filled the spaces between my gruffness and his ambition. She was the bridge. Without her, we were two strangers who happened to share the same last name. He would look at his watch, talk about an exam or a project, and I would nod, pretending to understand the pressures of his new world. I was proud of him, so proud it hurt, but I could feel him slipping away, like a handful of dry sand through my fingers. Every visit felt more like an obligation, a box he needed to check before he could get on with his real life. Then Amanda entered the picture, and the slow drift became a rapid current pulling him away. When he first brought her to the house, I saw it in her eyes. She looked at our home, the home I built, and that Elena filled with love, as if it were a quaint but unfortunate relic. She smiled a lot, a polite, thin smile that never quite reached her eyes. She complimented the food but pushed it around her plate. She was careful, clinical. I could see she was calculating how to sand down all my rough edges, how to make me fit into the polished life she envisioned for my son. Roberto, blinded by love and ambition, saw her as his partner in ascent. I saw her as the architect of a new wall between us, one built with expensive bricks of social status and modern taste. The first thing to go was Elena's memory, piece by piece. It started with our wedding anniversary. The first year after she passed, Roberto brought me a bottle of tequila, and we had a quiet drink in her honor. The next year, it was a phone call, rushed, from his car. "Thinking of you and Mom today, Dad," he said, his voice distracted. The third year, there was nothing. Silence. I went to the cemetery alone with a small bouquet of marigolds, her favorite. I sat by her grave and I talked to her. I told her about the silence, about the growing distance. It became my ritual, my private communion with our past, a past that my son was actively working to forget. Amanda would probably have called it morbid, but for me, it was the only thing that felt real. Then came the grandchildren, Mateo and Sophia. When they were little, they were my joy. They'd run into my arms, their laughter filling the quiet house. They loved my stories, the real ones, about the mill, about growing up in Zacatecas. They would sit on my lap, their eyes wide with wonder. I was Papelito, their hero. But as they grew, Amanda began to manage their time, and their time with me became scarce. The excuses were always plausible, always wrapped in a veneer of concern. "They have too much homework, Papa. The air quality in your neighborhood isn't great for Sophia's allergies. We don't want them to tire you out." Slowly, Papalito became just Grandpa, a figure they saw on holidays, someone to give a quick, awkward hug to before retreating to their iPads. The renovation of my house was Amanda's masterpiece of erasure. It was presented as a generous gift for my 75th birthday. "We want you to be comfortable, Dad, to have a modern space," Roberto explained, his words sounding rehearsed. They hired decorators. They painted the warm yellow walls a sterile white. They threw out the old wooden dining table where we had shared thousands of meals, replacing it with a small glass one. Elena's hand-stitched curtains were replaced with cold, gray blinds. They even took down most of her photographs, leaving only one small, framed picture on my nightstand. They said they were decluttering. I knew they were sanitizing my life, scrubbing away the evidence of a past they were ashamed of. I was living in a stranger's house, a house that used to be my home. Family dinners at their apartment became a form of quiet torture. I would sit at the far end of their long, polished dining table, a ghost at the feast. The conversation flowed around me, a river of topics I couldn't navigate. Stock market trends, their friends' trips to Europe, the politics of the Parents' Association at the kids' private school. I would try to chime in, maybe with a comment about the price of avocados at the market, or a story about a neighbor, and the conversation would pause for a polite, awkward second before moving on, leaving me stranded on my little island of irrelevance. Amanda would occasionally turn to me and ask, "More wine, Arturo?" with a smile that was all teeth, a gesture not of inclusion but of pity. I learned to just eat my food, to stay quiet, to become part of the scenery. The phone calls became a weekly script. My phone would ring every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, sharp. It was Roberto. "Hi, Dad. How are you? Everything okay?" The questions were rapid fire, leaving no room for a real answer. Before I could say more than, "I'm fine, son," he would continue, "Great. Amanda and the kids say hi. We're about to head out to brunch. Just wanted to check in. Talk to you next week. Bye." Click. It was a task on his weekend checklist, wedged between the gym and a fancy meal. The calls weren't about connection. They were about absolution. He was performing the duty of a good son so he could sleep at night, but he had long since forgotten how to simply be one. Each call left me feeling emptier than the silence it had briefly interrupted. I remember one Saturday, they had a plumbing issue at their apartment, a clogged drain in their fancy master bathroom. I went over, thinking I could help. I brought my old toolbox, the one I'd had for 50 years, the one with the tools that helped me build our first home. I was explaining to Roberto what we needed to do, how to snake the drain properly, just like I taught him when he was a boy. Amanda walked in, saw me with a wrench in my hand, and she physically recoiled. "Arturo, please," she said, her voice laced with a gentle but firm horror. "Don't trouble yourself. We've already called a plumber. A professional." She took the wrench from my hand as if it were contaminated and placed it back in my box. In that moment, she didn't just dismiss my help. She dismissed my entire life's worth of practical knowledge, of self-sufficiency. I was obsolete. The humiliations were small, like 1,000 tiny paper cuts that eventually bleed you dry. It was the way Amanda would rewash a dish I had just cleaned, saying, "The water needs to be hotter, Arturo." It was the way Roberto would explain simple things to me in a loud, slow voice, as if I were a child. It was the forgotten birthdays, not just mine, but Elena's too. It was the empty chair at my table on Christmas Eve, because they had decided to go skiing in Colorado at the last minute, sending me a pre-cooked meal from a gourmet shop as a replacement for their presents. Each instance was a small confirmation that I was no longer the patriarch, the provider, the man of the house. I was a relic, a responsibility, a piece of their past they were politely waiting to be rid of. The final realization, the one that cemented the cold resolve in my heart, came a few months before that 85th birthday. I had dropped by their apartment unannounced to give Mateo a small wooden car I had carved for him, something I used to do all the time. The front door was slightly ajar, and I heard Amanda on the phone inside, talking to one of her friends. Her voice was light, complaining. "Yes, we have to do a whole birthday thing for Roberto's dad next month." She sighed. "It's such a production. Honestly, having him over for a whole evening is it's a drag. You have to talk about things he understands. You have to watch what you say. It's like managing a difficult child." She laughed. "He's just, a weight, you know." A weight. That was the word she used. I stood there, frozen in the hallway, the little wooden car feeling heavy in my hand. A weight. That's what I had become to them. All the years of sweat and sacrifice, the double shifts, the patched boots, the promise to Elena, it had all led to this. I was not a father, not a grandfather. I was a burden, a chore on their weekend schedule, a difficult child to be managed. I didn't knock. I turned around as quietly as I could, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm of defeat in my chest. I walked back to my car, got in, and just sat there for a long time, looking at the sterile, perfect facade of their building. The pain was immense, but underneath it, something else was being forged. A decision, a plan, a way to finally tell a story they would be forced to listen to. That day, the grief for the son I had lost was complete. I wasn't just grieving for Elena anymore. I was grieving for the boy who loved my stories, for the young man I sent to university, for the family I thought I had built. The Roberto who lived in that apartment was a stranger, and Amanda was his keeper. They lived in a world where a father's love was measured in inconvenience. The sadness was so profound it became a kind of peace. There was nothing left to lose, nothing left to hope for from them. The emotional tether had been cut, not by me, but by years of their neglect, culminating in that one carelessly cruel word, await. I was free from the illusion that they might one day remember. That's why, on my 85th birthday, when Roberto told me no one was interested in my stories, I didn't fight back, I didn't argue. What was the point? He was only saying out loud what they had been showing me for years. His words were not the wound. They were merely the salt poured into it. In that moment of public humiliation, I felt a strange sense of vindication. He had finally confirmed it all himself. He had handed me the final piece of the puzzle. He had given me the moral authority to do what I knew I had to do. The silence that fell over me wasn't one of defeat. It was the silence of a man making a final, binding contract with himself. The evolution of their abandonment was a masterclass in quiet cruelty. It wasn't a dramatic shouting match or a slammed door. It was a slow, methodical erasure. It was in the changing of furniture, the forgotten anniversaries, the managed visits, the condescending tones, the polite dismissals. They didn't throw me out of their lives. They just made my space in it smaller and smaller, until I was just a speck, an invisible man sitting on a fancy sofa in their cold, white room. They thought they were in control, that they were the ones setting the terms of our relationship. They had no idea that their greatest neglect was in failing to know the man they were casting aside. This slow decay of our family was more painful than any single act could have been. A clean break hurts, but it heals. This was a festering wound, picked at every so often with a polite smile or a dutiful phone call. They kept me just close enough to satisfy their conscience, but far enough away to not be bothered by my reality. They wanted the idea of a father, the photograph on the wall for social media, but not the actual man with his calloused hands, his old-fashioned values, and his stories. They didn't just abandon me. They curated me, editing out all the parts they found inconvenient until almost nothing was left. I often wonder if they ever noticed what they were doing, or if it was all a subconscious act of social climbing. Did Roberto ever look at me and see the father who gave him everything? Or did he only see a reminder of a past he was desperate to outrun? Did Amanda ever see a human being? Or just an obstacle to her perfect family image? I don't think I'll ever know the answers. But sitting there, after overhearing her on the phone, I realized it didn't matter anymore. Their reasons were their own. My path was now clear. My promise to Elena had taken on a new, final meaning. It wasn't just about making Roberto remember his roots anymore. It was about showing him the true value of what he had thrown away. It was about teaching a final lesson, not with words or pleas for attention, but with the one thing he and his wife truly understood: consequences. The plan that began to form in my mind wasn't born of hate. It was born of a profound and sorrowful love. A love for the wife I had lost, for the son I once had, and for the dignity I refused to let them take from me. It would be my last story, the only one they would ever be truly interested in, and they would only hear it when it was too late. My son and his wife, they saw an old man. They looked at my wrinkled skin, my slow way of walking, the slight tremble in my hands, and they made up their minds. They saw a relic, a man whose time had passed, whose mind was full of useless stories about a world they had no interest in. They saw my hands, scarred from a lifetime of fire and steel, and they saw a weakness. They thought those hands were empty. They never once imagined that those same hands had quietly built a fortress around my dignity, a fortress they would never be able to breach. They believed my life's worth could be measured by my pension, a few thousand pesos a month, They were so very, very wrong. You see, there are two kinds of wealth in this world. There is the kind my son understands. The numbers on a screen, the balance in a bank account, the logo on a car. It's a loud, flashy kind of wealth that needs to be seen. But there is another kind, a quieter, heavier kind. It's the kind you can feel under your feet. It's the earth. My father, a man who never learned to read but who could read the sky and the soil, taught me that. God isn't making any more land, me Joe, he used to say. Whatever else they take from you, they can't take the ground you stand on. While Roberto was learning about financial markets at the Tech, I was holding on to my father's lesson. My secret wasn't in a bank. It was back home in the dust of Zacatecas. It started a long, long time ago, back when I was still a young man at the Fundadora. The overtime shifts, the ones that felt like they were stealing pieces of your soul, paid a little extra. Most of the men would spend it on a few extra beers, a new radio, something to make the hard life a little easier right then. I understood that. But Elaine and I, we had a different idea. Every few months I would take that extra money, a small handful of crumpled bills, and I would send it to my cousin back in our pueblo near Fresnillo. He would buy land for me. Not good land. Scraps. The pieces on the edge of the desert that nobody wanted, that were too rocky to farm, too far from the river to be of any use. This was our secret pact, Elena's and mine. It was our por si acaso, our just in case the mill closed down, just in case one of us got sick. Just in case the city, this great monster of progress, decided to chew us up and spit us out. It was our escape route, a path back to where we came from. It was more than just a financial plan. It was an anchor. It was a promise to ourselves that we would never forget the taste of the dust, the smell of the dry earth after a rare rain. It was a way of holding on to our roots, even as we were trying to give our son wings to fly far away from them. It was our silent testament to the life we left behind, but never truly forgot. My cousin would write back telling me about the parcels. Arturo, I bought you another 5 hectares of pure asterisk tepete, he'd write. The goats won't even walk on it. The old men in the plaza are saying you've lost your mind, spending good money on useless rock. I would read the letters to Elena, and we would laugh. Let them think I was a fool. We weren't buying it for what it was. We were buying it for what it represented, a piece of home. Over 30 years, we collected almost 200 hectares of what everyone else considered worthless Zacatecan wasteland. A collection of forgotten lots, scattered around the municipality, paid for with sweat and fire. We never told Roberto, not when he was a boy, and not when he became a man. It wasn't that we didn't trust him. In the beginning, we wanted him to build his own life, to stand on his own 2 feet, without the safety net of an inheritance he didn't know existed. We wanted him to feel the fire of necessity, the same fire that had forged me. We believed it would make him stronger, more self-reliant. Later, as he grew more distant, as Amanda came into his life, the reason for the silence changed. It was no longer about teaching him a lesson in hard work. It became a matter of protection, protecting our legacy from their disdain, from their modern world that saw no value in old things like loyalty or a patch of dusty land. When Elena was in her final days, the secret became our last comfort. I finally told her the full extent of it, how many pieces of our homeland we now owned. I spread the old, brittle property deeds on her bed, and she touched them with her weak hand. She wasn't surprised. She just smiled, a faint, tired smile. Our earth, Arturo, she whispered, our little piece of forever. She made me promise again. Take care of the boy, she said, her eyes pleading. But this land, this is for us. This is the proof of our life. Don't let them just waste it on things. Make sure he understands its true worth before he ever touches it, I promised. It was a sacred addition to her first request. For 15 years after her death, the land was just that, a secret comfort, a collection of papers in an old metal box under my bed. It was my private conversation with Elena. Then, about 2 years ago, things began to stir. My cousin, now an old man himself, started calling me with news. Surveyors from the government were all over the area. There were rumors of a new highway, whispers of foreign investors. The sleepy little towns of our youth were waking up. Something big was coming. I didn't pay it much mind at first. Progress had always been a story that happened to other people, in other places. But the rumors became news. The federal government announced a new tourism initiative, the Ruta del Desierto. They were designating a nearby town as a Pueblo Mágico, and our forgotten corner of Zacatecas was right in the middle of it. A new highway was planned to connect Zacatecas City to San Luis Potosi, cutting right through the region. Suddenly, the area was attractive, and a group of investors from Europe, looking to build a massive, exclusive spa and wellness retreat for rich foreigners, decided that the useless land, with its stark, rocky beauty and perfect isolation, was the most desirable location in all of Mexico. My land, my worthless patches of rock and dust, my collection of forgotten corners that the goats wouldn't even walk on, it was right there, dead center. The land that nobody wanted for 50 years was suddenly the most valuable real estate in the state. The rocky hills were perfect for villas with a rustic view. The arid plains were ideal for meditation gardens and organic farming. The isolation they once mocked was now marketed as exclusive privacy. The foolish investment of a Monterrey steelworker had, by a stroke of fate and a government decree, become a gold mine. The call came on a Tuesday morning. There was a lawyer from a fancy firm in Polanco, in Mexico City. He spoke in a smooth, polished Spanish that sounded nothing like the way we talk up north. He said he represented an international investment group. He said they had consolidated the property records for the area and that my name kept coming up. He said they were prepared to make a comprehensive offer for all my parcels, a single transaction to acquire the entire 200 hectares. He asked if I was sitting down. I told him I'd been on my feet for 85 years, I could handle it. Then he told me the number. He said it so calmly, as if he were telling me the time. "Señor Arturo," he said, "our clients are prepared to offer you a sum of 35 million pesos for the totality of your land holdings." I was silent. The line crackled. 35 million. I made him repeat it. Then I made him say it again. 35 million pesos. That's more money than every man on my old shift at the mill made in their entire lives, combined. It was a number so large it felt like a joke. It was the price of 100 fancy apartments in San Pedro. It was a king's ransom. And it was mine. The irony was so thick I could taste it, bitter and sweet at the same time. My son, the brilliant engineer with his MBA, the man who managed investments and scoffed at my simple ways, lived in a world of calculated risks and market projections. He and his wife looked down on my past, on my rough hands, and my simple life. Yet my simple, old-fashioned wisdom, born from my father's words and my wife's prudence, had yielded a fortune beyond their wildest dreams. They were so busy looking forward into their bright modern future that they never bothered to look down at the ground beneath their feet, at the foundation I had laid for them. My secret wasn't just land, it was a lesson in value. In that moment, everything became clear. The humiliation of my birthday party, the years of quiet neglect, the feeling of being an invisible ghost in their lives, it all settled into a new perspective. It wasn't a tragedy anymore, it was a prelude. While they were sitting there, ignoring me, absorbed in their phones and planning a vacation that cost a few thousand pesos, I was sitting on a secret that could buy and sell their entire world 10 times over. They saw a poor, pathetic old man whose stories were worthless. But I wasn't the poor one in that room. They were. They were poor in memory, in gratitude, in love, and they had no idea. My silence in that cold, white living room was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a man holding a royal flush, waiting for the right moment to lay his cards on the table. It was the quiet calm of knowing you have the ultimate power, not to crush, but to reveal the truth. Their dismissal of my stories was their biggest mistake, because my life was the one story they should have paid attention to, and its final chapter was about to be written, and they would find themselves to be nothing more than a footnote in it. The money, the 35 million pesos, it stopped being just money. It transformed. It became a tool. It became the instrument of a final, powerful lesson. It was the means by which I could finally fulfill my promise to Elena in its entirety, not just to take care of our boy, but to make him understand the value of his roots, of the life he had so carelessly discarded. This fortune was not going to be a gift. It was going to be a mirror, and in it, my son would finally be forced to see the reflection of the man he had become. The day after I got the call from the lawyer in Mexico City, I went to the bank. I took out a small portion of my pension, just enough for a bus ticket and a decent meal. I didn't go to Zacatecas. My journey was much shorter. I went to a small, dusty office in the center of Monterrey, a few blocks from the Macro Plaza. The office belonged to Licenciado Morales, a man almost as old as me, a lawyer who had helped the union men from the mill with their problems for over 50 years. He wasn't fancy like the lawyers my son knew. He was honest. He poured 2 small glasses of water, and I sat across from his worn wooden desk, the same desk where my father had signed his own papers decades ago. I didn't tell him a long, sad story. I didn't need to. I just told him what I wanted to do. I was going to sell the land. And then, we were going to write my final story, my last will and testament. Licenciado Morales listened without interruption, his old eyes looking at me over the top of his spectacles. He didn't show surprise or pity. He just nodded, understanding the things a man doesn't say. I explained the terms. The 35 million pesos from the sale of the land in Zacatecas would be placed into a secure trust. The house, the one I built, and that Elena made a home, would also be part of the estate. My son, Roberto, my only child, would be named as the sole heir to everything. He would have the right to claim it all, but there was a condition, a single lock on the door to this fortune, a lock that only a true son could open. I watched the old lawyer's pen scratch across the paper, each word carrying the weight of a lifetime. He understood. This wasn't about revenge. It was about memory. The will is very simple. Upon my passing, Roberto is to be summoned to that very office. Licenciado Morales will read him the terms, and then he will ask him one single question. The inheritance, all of it, hinges on his answer. The question is this: what was the complete and exact promise that I, your father, made to your mother Elena on the night she died? I know my son. He might remember something vague about taking care of him, but he won't remember her other words, the most important ones. He won't remember her plea to never forget where we came from, that our roots were our greatest wealth. He wasn't listening then, and he hasn't been listening since. His ignorance, the very thing he flaunted on my birthday, will be the key to his own disinheritance. It is a justice so quiet, so personal, that only he and the ghosts of his parents will understand its true meaning. And if he cannot answer, as I know he won't, the will is, again, very clear. The house in the Colonia Independencia is to be sold. All the money, the 35 million from the land, and the proceeds from the house sale, is to be used to create the Arturo and Elena Rojas Foundation. Its sole purpose will be to provide scholarships for young men and women from the working-class neighborhoods of Monterrey, kids from the Independencia, from La Fama, from the Acero, so they can go to university. So they can have the chance I gave my son, but without having to forget who they are or where they came from. Elena's wish will be fulfilled. Our roots will become the soil for a new generation's dreams. Our legacy won't be in a cold apartment in San Pedro. It will be in the futures of hundreds of kids who understand the value of hard work. I walked out of that dusty office and into the Monterey sun feeling lighter than I had in years. The weight wasn't gone, but it had been transformed. It was no longer the weight of humiliation, but the solid weight of a decision well made, of a promise finally kept. I went home to my quiet, white house. I took the small, framed photograph of Elena from my nightstand, and I placed it right in the middle of the cold, glass dining table. I looked at her, and I smiled. My son was right about one thing. My stories were, perhaps, worthless to him, but my life, the one I built with my hands and with my heart, the one I shared with her, was worth a fortune. And I had made sure it would end up in the right hands. I had finally written a story that would outlive us all.